Greetings, my friends. I hope you're doing well. Just, you know, tr should I go with my lame joke? I'm just traveling close to Earth and thought I'd drop in and, send you a message. We're going to look today at chapter 7. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this idea of the nature of adolescence. And what I mean by that is the physical and cognitive changes that are happening that are being driven by nature, by this natural, biological development of the individual. And I want to really focus on this idea of there being two main huge periods of developmental growth in life. That the first one is the conception till two, like kind of when the egg is initially fertilized, all the way till um, kind of 2 years old when the child's starting to walk and talk. And during that whole period of brain construction and development. And then there's sort of this second major developmental period that we call puberty. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it specifically relates to things like psychology, right? And our experience. So grab a coffee or a tea or whatever, or whatever you want. And I hope you're doing well. And I've really enjoyed being your teacher. The Your first sets of reflections were really good. I'm going to get to the second set soon in the quest assignments. This is going to be the last chapter that you have a test on. So let's get into it. Okay, so there's a long history of worrying about how adolescence will turn out. As far back as 1904, Stanley Hall proposed that we are best to understand adolescence as like a storm and stress phase of conflict and mood swings. So he's saying that in mood swings, everyone likes being defined as that. But he's saying as early as 1904 that there's something psychology wise unique. Remember, Stanley Hall's a guy that he was called the Kingmaker. There's an interesting book I read once called The Kingmaker, and it was about Stanley Hall and how he brought Freud and Jung to the States. He was huge. He was one of the big American psychologists at the time, and he's the guy that popularized the use of norms. That it's like normal for people to start doing this at this time and to start walking at this time. And he was very much observational developmental psychologist. However, when Daniel Offer and his colleagues in 1988 studied the self-images of adolescents in a number of countries, they found that at least 73% displayed rather healthy self-images, and that this storm and stress is that would have been what, 27% of the population. So it's like adolescence is tough for some people. It's not necessarily tough for everybody, but one of the reasons it's tough is because not only are you going through these major biological changes and hormonal changes, you're also going through major social changes, like going to high school, obviously, right? It says, yeah, in the tastes and manners, the young people of every generation have seemed unnervingly radical and different from adults. It's like every generation complains about like the kids these days, is basically what I'm saying with that, right? Is that there's this, and part of that is because there's this natural tendency of people as they reach the teen years to push back a bit on their culture, right? So obviously their culture looks back at them and is like, what are these kids doing? Or what are, kids these days, that point. But my point is that there's a deep biopsychological effect happening to these individuals, right? To us when we were younger, to these teens, to these people that are reaching puberty, that puberty is actually best understood as a brain neuroendocrine process. So brain neuroendocrine, meaning the connection between basically your cognitive system and your hormonal system. That the endocrine system is like heavily related to hormones. That occurs primarily in early adolescence, and there's rapid changes taking place, like and primarily like in terms of changes happening to, like I say, the growth of the penis in males and menstruation in females, and that there's secondary things that's happening, like growth of pubic hair, development of breasts, changes in voice tone, big changes in both height and weight, the timing of which differs. Girls tend to mature faster, right? By about roughly 18 months. So there's this, so this is kind of like the physical aspect of it, right? Now, the next thing I want to show you, I'm going to show you like this. I'm going to actually, please bear with me. Usually I would just have this inserted in the next slide, but we're going to have to do it this way, unfortunately. But I think it'll work okay. Okay, I put headphones on. So you don't hear it twice. Made that mistake before.
The endocrine system is composed of 10 glands in different parts of the body.
It kind of muffles the background noise.
When the endocrine glands are stimulated, they produce molecules called hormones and release them into the vascular system. Hormones are like chemical messengers, transported by the blood to target cells. When it reaches a target cell, the hormone attaches itself to a specific receptor, which triggers a physiological process such as cell division. The production of many hormones is controlled by two small structures located at the base of the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is composed of nerve nuclei that control vital functions such as sleep. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland, which is the main hormone-producing gland. The pituitary gland alone secretes 9 different hormones. Vasopressin, for example, regulates kidney functioning. Oxytocin causes contractions of the uterus during childbirth. Other pituitary hormones control skin pigmentation and bone growth. Together, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland produce a third of the body's hormones.
This is where, like, the difference between, at different times in the course, I've said what's interesting about humans and other high-end mammals is that, and not just that, but okay, what's interesting is how we have this ability to send messages both electrically and chemically, and you can see how like this same gland, and you can think of a gland as like a sac that holds chemicals and can strategically release them, sort of, and send messages. Whatever send, in even the language, right? Like, what does send messages mean when you're talking about in your body? Well, it means information is sending. This, we're really talking about also like the nervous system and the spine and stuff, but like at the most basic level, it's messages get sent in your body either through electrical impulse, or which is sometimes called action potential, or through biochemicals, right? Like biological chemical messages, hormones. Yeah. Okay. So now I think I can just switch right back to the PowerPoint. Hopefully this is all still recording. Sorry, I know you're hearing me talking. It's a little different. I gotta figure out how to just keep recording in PowerPoint, but Zoom feels it's interesting if I can get out of my own head and not focus on the fact that I'm recording, and if I can just, like, do my presentation, it's not that bad. Okay. Here's just a second quick clip I want to show you, and I only have a couple clips, so you won't have to wait while I do that a ton of times. Just to make sure I'm sharing the sound. Here we go.
What are hormones? A hormone is a chemical messenger that is secreted or released into our bloodstream by specific organs known as glands. Hormones regulate or control many processes in our body, including blood glucose levels, water content in blood, general growth, and blood pressure, just to name a few. As an example, thyroxine, which is a hormone secreted by your thyroid gland, helps to regulate metabolism. In other lessons, you will learn about a few of these hormones in more detail. Several hormones are secreted by the pituitary gland, located right below the hypothalamus in your brain. Instructions are given by the hypothalamus
Again, remember, a gland is, this is one thing that's kind of cool. I can comment, I guess. Remember that the gland is an organ that can release these chemicals.
to the pituitary gland according to current conditions in our body. The secreted hormones travel through the bloodstream to target organs where either a specific response is directly produced, or it stimulates or causes the target organ to secrete its own hormones. We can think of this like a post office system. Hormones, or posts, must reach the correct target organs or addresses for the right response to occur. Feeling thirsty? When the hypothalamus detects low levels of water in blood, it signals or tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone called the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, into your bloodstream. ADH travels to your kidneys, in this case the target organ, and causes water to be absorbed, so urine becomes more concentrated and output is decreased. Drinking more water increases the water content in your blood, which then causes the hypothalamus to signal the pituitary gland to secrete less ADH. Less ADH means your kidneys will absorb less water, causing urine to become less concentrated and output is increased. Ever felt suddenly frightened? When threatened, the brain activates neurons that stimulate the adrenal gland located right above your kidneys to rapidly secrete adrenaline. Adrenaline then acts on your heart and lungs to increase heart rate and breathing rate. This, along with other physiological responses, is known as the fight or flight response and is activated very quickly. At the same time, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland to secrete the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which travels to the adrenal glands to secrete a hormone known as cortisol. Cortisol acts in target organs to allow the body to adapt long-term to stress. So to review, hormones are chemical messengers secreted by glands into the bloodstream and produce a specific response when they reach the target organ.
Okay. Tremendous. Okay, so if you could just kind of jot down some of these points, I'd like you to know what like the HPG process is, right? That the hypothalamus sends this message to the pituitary gland that releases messages to the gonads, or like the testicles or the ovaries, releases hormones and controls the growth of the gonads, right? So testes in males, ovaries in females. Early adolescence, girls tend to outweigh boys, but by about age 14, this catches up, right? Growth spurt occurs about 2 years earlier for girls, right? So you see this is not overall height, but this is like how much height they're gaining in centimeters per year. Tremendous physical, I'm just going to read something to you. The tremendous physical changes that occur during adolescence reflects activation of the HPG axis, which you see there, which just means the hypothalamus sends the message to the pituitary glands to release hormones that activate the gonads. The hypothalamus is the structure in the brain that monitors eating and sex and other things, but those two things. Increased release of the hypothalamic hormone stimulates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is this important endocrine gland that controls the growth and regulates other glands by releasing its own hormones. The gonads, which are the testes in males and the ovaries in females, releases testosterone and estrogen, hormones that are particularly important in giving rise to pubertal changes, puberty. The concentration of certain hormones increases dramatically during adolescence. Testosterone and estradiol, a type of estrogen, are present in the hormonal makeup of both boys and girls. However, whereas testosterone is associated with the development of the genitals, an increase in height, and a change in voice in boys, estradiol is associated with breast, uterine, and skeletal development in girls. The extent to which this influx of hormones also contributes to psychological development in adolescence is still under debate, and the relationship between hormones and behavior is both complex and bidirectional, meaning both hormones affect behavior and behavior affects hormones. That's what bidirectional would mean, like they both influence each other. Okay, this is the last video I want to show. Just a quick 2-minute neuroscience. Now, I wanted to just show this link. Okay, so now this is an HPA axis. So I just told you HPG, so hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the gonads is what we were talking about. This, I couldn't find a perfect video to show that, but I found this one that talks about the same idea, but this is just showing how it relates to the adrenal glands relate as opposed to the gonads. So this is like just showing you this idea of like the brain recognizing that it's time to do the thing. That's what the H does. What the P does is it actually releases the hormones that initiate the process once it gets to the gonads. But the pituitary gland does other things. And that's one of the reasons it's so interesting and so advanced. Like it has the ability to send different messages to do different things. Which again, unless you're not thinking about it deeply, like if you're thinking about it deeply, that's kind of mind-blowing. And when you're looking at this from a developmental psychology perspective, you're looking at it from the perspective of not only is it interesting that everyone goes through this process of puberty, even though like there's so much variation and some people have problems in that time period and all kinds of things. There's all kinds of ways that plays out, but it affects everybody. And at somewhat the same time, right? Obviously, like it starts earlier or later. There's gender differences. There's all kinds of differences. But there's more similarity than not. There's more similarity than randomness. And so, okay, so anyway, so here I want to just show this kind of process. He does it pretty good.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the HPA axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis is best known for its role in our body's reaction to stress.
So this is just looking at, okay, so how the hypothalamic, or how the hypothalamus identifies the time. Like, and this is where it's so fascinating. Like, if you ask a question of like, how does the hypothalamus know it's time to start puberty? It's like, good question. It's like the timing is built into the genetics. It's so complexly deep. And then it sends the message to the pituitary gland, which is able to release these hormones to actually sort of do the thing. And it can do different things, and it can help you have it can create an adrenal response or like adrenaline, or it can also like affect things like puberty. It can affect things like your sexual organs. So this is just sort of to show that.
The HPA axis includes a group of hormone-secreting glands from the nervous and endocrine systems, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. The hypothalamus is a small neuroendocrine structure situated just above the brainstem that controls the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, a hormone-secreting gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland can release hormones into the bloodstream to reach a variety of targets.
Sorry, I know it sounds a bit audio choppy, but it's just
in the case of the HPA axis, hormones released from the pituitary gland travel down to the kidneys and influence the secretion of hormones from endocrine glands called the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. The primary function of the HPA axis is to regulate the stress response. When we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH.
Okay, so like look at so sorry it's choppy. What it's doing is it's cutting out the background music, and I tried forever to figure out how to make Zoom stop doing that, and I can't figure it out. It's saying so if you look at this as like, you can see the beginning of that word as almost looking like it says cortisol, but it's the corticotropin releasing hormone. So it's going to be the hormone that's going to trigger the release of that.
CRH signals the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, into the bloodstream. ACTH travels down to the adrenal glands, where it prompts the release of a hormone called cortisol from the cortex or outer layer of the adrenal glands. The release of cortisol causes a number of changes that help the body to deal with stress. For example, it helps to mobilize energy like glucose, so the body has enough energy to cope with a prolonged stressor. When cortisol levels in the blood get high, this is sensed by receptors in areas of the brain like the hypothalamus and hippocampus, which leads to the shutting off of the stress response through what is known as a negative feedback mechanism.
Yeah, you could also call that like the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. So you've probably heard a million times of fight and flight, right? And you can call that the kind of activation of the sympathetic nervous system, but people talk less about the so there's a sympathetic nervous system, and then parallel to that is the parallel sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system's nickname is rest and digest, as opposed to fight and flight. It's the part that, if you want to trigger your parasympathetic nervous system, you put your hands above your head, you get like this. Basically, I can just demonstrate it. And then you want to breathe deeply. And you put your arms like this because you're lengthening and making your diaphragm bigger so you can take bigger breaths, and you're taking a few real deep breaths. What you're doing is if you do that a few times, what you're doing is you're flooding your system with oxygen, and you're actually flushing the cortisol. It's like a biohack. You can do that when you're stressed. Menarche, or girl's first menstruation, uh, tends to come rather late in the pubertal cycle. Around the world, the average age of this has declined significantly since the mid 19th century, likely the result of improvements of things like nutrition. Body weight can affect when this happens. For girls, stress can initiate physical changes, and that stress can be either like personal internalized stress, or it can be stressful living situations. So, for example, being in a single parent family often leads to an earlier first menstruation, right? Consistent with evidence that father absence predicts early menarche. It's like the body. Again, this is like such an interesting example of the complex interaction between biological and social. That social factors can influence biological processes that are genetically initiated, which is so interesting. It's such a Human beings are such a dynamic, biopsychosocial, emotional, spiritual system, physical. One of the things, this last point, I say adolescents tend to be preoccupied with their body, and that's oftentimes in a self-critical way, right? It's not like they're always standing in the mirror being like, I'm so beautiful. Unfortunately, it's probably more likely the opposite. And this matters because this is a time in life when people are very worried about social comparison and fitting in and peers, and when girls especially are, and boys, I should just say, when students are at the age of like grade 8, grade 9, that's when peer pressure conformity is at its absolute peak. It's when people are starting to become much more aware of how other people see them, much more about how other people think of them. So it's almost this perfect storm. And then, not that I haven't even mentioned things like social media and TikTok and Instagram and all this stuff, giving these like this pollution of who you're supposed to be. And then there's like the whole aspect of the entire advertisement world aimed basically at especially teenage girls. It's a problem. It's like something I focus on a lot, and not the least of which reason is because I have two daughters myself and a lot of female students, and it's like when we start talking about things like body image, it's like it's not all just in these young girls' heads. It's like also a result of the social pressures they're feeling in a million different directions. And some of it's societal pressures that have sort of always been there, and some of it's pretty direct on purpose manipulation, which I don't have a lot of patience for. Um, because this is all linked to things like self-esteem and self-harm and all these struggles that teens deal with. during this like incredibly tumultuous period of life, this like chaotic in some ways period of change. And it's interesting when you look at how people respond, right? And again, this is a little bit, it'd be interesting. Oops, let me go back. It'd be interesting to have this conversation with you in person, is that the findings on this are actually kind of interesting. And so that boys that mature faster than their peers tend to report it as a positive thing. Maybe because it makes them, maybe they get bigger quicker, so they're like better at sports, or I'm using like super stereotypical ways of understanding why that would be. Maybe they get like, people think they're older, whereas girls tend to report it as less positive. And early maturing girls, like so early maturing in comparison to their peer group, tend to be more prone to things that we tend to associate with some of our worries of later teens, like things like smoking, alcohol, depression, eating disorders, earlier sexual experiences. And it's like, you could all probably write interesting papers on why you think that there's that gender difference. Like, why would late maturing boys? Oh, that's interesting, right? So it says, I'm saying that I started to read the second point. The third point said the second point. Early maturing boys tend to perceive themselves more positively, tend to be more successful at pure relationships than later maturing boys. But later maturing boys, by the time they reach their 30s, tend to have a stronger sense of who they are than earlier maturing boys. So it's almost like for boys that are ahead of the maturation curve of their peers, the short term benefit is a thing because but that short term benefit doesn't stably project into the future, right? Because what if you look at the second bullet point and the third bullet point, they seem to contradict each other unless you put in the variable of time. It's like, okay, well, me being bigger than my classmates in grade 6 when we're all playing sports at recess might mean I'm, if I'm just making this up, but it might mean I'm like the best player. That might be cool, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's always, eventually everyone's going to catch up to me, so that advantage is time limited. Look at really both of these things in both the positive and the negative example are arguments for the fact that people treat you differently when you appear older than you are, and that can be a positive and a negative. Again, I would love to have your feedback on that, like, just be interesting. Sometimes the problem in developmental psych, right, is like it's not just a list of things students want to hear. It's like observational psychology, in a sense. Developmental psychology has a huge observational component of like, if we want to look at the patterns that are different between, say, males and females, it's like we do that by studying thousands of people. We do it statistically. And so the results aren't always what you might like. Okay, so just to look at, we're looking here at some of the big areas in the brain that are changing during adolescence, like the corpus callosum. These nerve fibers connect the brain's two hemispheres, right? This thickens in adolescence. So the part that's connecting the two hemispheres, this bundle of nerve fibers, right? So it's basically, think of what a nerve fiber would be. It's like, again, all this stuff, it's like you can write the sentence, but it's like to actually understand it so deep. It's like, so you have these cells that can process information, these nerve fibers that are connecting the two hemispheres, and it's actually getting thickened. It's like a cord of cables that's getting thickened, and more better high-end HDMI and Ethernet cables. Obviously, it's not that, but it's like this better and better connection. In the prefrontal cortex, this judgment region that's developing isn't going to be fully finished until early childhood. And remember, that part of the brain's there, but when we say it's not fully developed, we're talking largely about the myelination that we've talked about earlier in this course, that the actual And whenever I talk about myelination, I always use the example. Sorry, this. Hopefully, you're not hearing that. Let me play with that page so much. But like a cord like this, right? It's messing up because I got the virtual background. But a cord like this, inside that cord is the copper wire that's sending the information, and on the outside is plastic that's protecting it. And that plastic that's protecting it is making sure that the communication goes smoothly and that there's not interference from it touching other wires. And the idea is that in your brain that happens too with your connections, but that happens with this like fatty substance. It's obviously not plastic. It's like a fatty cholesterol like substance that we call myelin, or like the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath, remember, meaning like the protective case you put a sword into. Then there's the amygdala, this limbic system, right? This emotional system, heavily involved in emotion. So now you're in this scenario where you have this you basically have this fully developed emotional system, this highly social world, this prefrontal cortex that's still myelinating. So this is going to result in, more impulsive, risky behavior compared to, say, this girl. She's going to be more risky and impulsive than she will be in a few years. Remember, the comparison only makes sense when you're comparing a person to themselves and saying that it's not that teenagers have brains that aren't developed, it's that their brains will be more developed when they're older almost, right? It's like, it sounds like I'm just saying the same thing, but some of these ideas make more sense if you view this as each person developing, right? Like developmental psychology, their brain's still in this developmental process, and not all aspects of their brain are developing at the same speed. It's everything's not at like 10%, 20%, 30%. It's like the different parts are developing at different speeds, and the emotional parts developed quicker, right? So it's like saying one of the reasons why teenagers are seem so maybe emotional and chaotic, and why it probably felt like that to us when we were at that stage, is because we were experiencing adult level emotion, but it was going through a different brain filter. I haven't even talked yet about this limbic response, or this whole old part of the brain, this lower subcortical. So subcortical just means under the cerebral cortex, underneath the wrinkly part, the lower subcortical system in the brain, that's the seat of emotions and experience, right? So in the amygdala is inside the limbic system, you could say. It's almost completely developed by this stage. In addition to these structural changes, levels of certain neurotransmitters change significantly with the onset of puberty. For example, there's a major increase in the neurotransmitter dopamine, which you've all heard of, which occurs in both the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system during adolescence. Researchers have found that this increase in dopamine plays a huge role in the reward-seeking behaviors of adolescents, right? So it's almost like not only do they feel less like hesitation towards doing something impulsive, their brain's rewarding them more for that. And I'd make the argument that that's completely evolutionary, that human beings throughout our evolutionary period have basically been raised as kids until they were at the point that they could either start their own families or contribute to the communities in food preparation or in defense. And that usually started to happen in the teen years, and that's been a cycle that's been happening for, like, it's so interesting to think that maybe there's an evolutionary reason why risk taking increases in the teens. And maybe because for a society to stay, for the gene pool to stay strong, the young adults needed to move out and reach out beyond the tribe, and maybe form relationships with different people, and maybe test things, and maybe like explore out, and that there's a biological underpinning to that. And it's the same thing that maybe made you want to move away to school. And it's like, that might be so hardwired behaviorally and cognitively and hormonally. And it's like, imprinted in our behavioral genetics. And what that's meaning is, maybe it allows us to have some patience with teenagers, especially if we're parents ourselves in the future, right? And and if some of you are like, because I know this is a second year course, right? So most of you will probably not be teenagers. Most of you will probably be like 20 or right around that. And there's probably a couple of you that are 19 though. So there might be some teenagers. But again, if you're 19, it's like you're basically on the other side of this discussion, right? Like I'm talking a little bit more about early and mid-teen years where a lot of these massive changes are happening. But yeah, so okay, so just to move in from tough topic to tougher topics. Yeah, so then at the same time there's this like emergence of a sexual identity, and that this is multifaceted, and this kind of occurs over a long period of time, from like starting to become more interested in people to like the development of romantic feelings and stuff like that. Sexual identity involves activities and interests and styles of behaviors and orientation. Many adolescents get into situations that they don't feel prepared for, right? And some of it is like maybe you're physically able to do things that you're not emotionally ready for, and cognitively. Sexuality or early sexual activity is higher the lower the income, the area. This is another one of those ones that would be so interesting to look at from a gender perspective, of like why boys that play a lot of sports tend to engage in more risky sexual behavior, but girls that play a lot of sports tend to do the exact reverse. That actually a teenage girl being heavily involved in sports is actually predictive of less sexual risk taking. But it's the opposite with boys. And then like you could have a very interesting discussion of, hey, that's a social reality. Like what are the social pressures and factors playing into that? And then so again, this is where developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology, that would be like an applied social psychology look at this. But then you could also look at the idea of like, where does that come from? And how does, yeah, so all these, there's just so many social, this is why like at Conestoga I teach developmental psychology, and so I teach like psychology classes and sociology classes, because there's a nice marriage there in topic, right? Because if you wanted to start looking at like, well, why is there that difference between boys and girls, it's hard to get around that without starting to get deep into like behavioral role modeling in media, the type of peer influences that they're receiving, how they're being parented, what they're being taught at school. It's like all this, like, it's linked to the socialization aspect big time. Infants born into adolescent mothers who have a low birth weight often have more illnesses, and some of those are kind of like childhood illnesses, but some of them are also definitely neurological. It's saying like, I know like what we teach kids around this stuff is like such like a hot debate. I do absolutely believe in age appropriateness, and that talking about these topics needs to be done carefully and skillfully, because there's real risks of trauma in early exposure that I don't think people take seriously enough. And that as soon as you have your own kids, you care about way more. You don't necessarily feel a lot of patience for people experimenting with ideas. But at the same time, it's like you don't want to go the other way of like, oh, never talk about it, because then people don't know what they're getting into, and people can get into risky situations. And so like again, it's like the topic that's like so difficult and risky nowadays is like what does healthy sexual education actually look like? And that's actually a harder question than you think, and there's a massive disagreement on that. And it's like it makes sense. It's like your perspective flips huge when you have kids yourself and you picture it as somebody else teaching your kids about these topics. And and so again, it's like the balance, because the evidence shows that like when done well, it doesn't actually increase risky behavior. It actually can lead to less adolescent pregnancy and STI transmission. And it's weird because I know I sound like when I'm talking about some of this stuff, I might sound like an old man, but as you get older, you get that protective instinct kind of increases, and it's like, um, and I know I'm talking to a group of people that are potential teachers. No, you're also getting pressured from other directions that, talk about this stuff as much as possible and as early as possible. And it's like, there's not a lot of evidence that, anyways, without getting too ranty on this, it's just obviously a point of current debate, big time, about how to actually do it. But I think when done well, can be very important. And there's all kinds of aspects of adolescent health that are complex and tricky, right? Like, yeah, like so some of this stuff's about things like obesity, like early obesity is on the rise. That has long-term health implications, right? Even though there's like, you're going to feel pushback anytime that any of your suggestions on healthy living have anything to do with lifestyle changes, right? But like, obviously, there's health effects associated with that. There's positive outcomes of exercise in adolescence. That exercise can reduce things like triglyceride levels, can lower blood pressure, can help with things like type 2 diabetes. That adolescents' exercise levels are associated with parenting and peer relationships and how much screen based activity they have. So it's like, it's interesting. It's like teens that have parents that stay active are more likely to stay active. When their friends stay active, they're more likely to stay active. If they play on teams and hang out with people that are active, they're more likely to. And if they don't, then they're less likely to. Most adolescent girls get less sleep than they need, and their circadian rhythm differs from that of children and other adults. Like, this is like an unspoken major crisis is in the sleep quality of especially teen girls. And if you add that to what I was saying earlier about all the push around body image and the growing issues around mental health, and to think that sleep disturbance is playing a role in that or is being influenced by that is, I think, obvious. Biological clocks change as people get older, right? So people, as you get older, when you actually start to feel alert, gets a little bit later in the morning, which is also one of the reasons why teenagers tend to struggle, like with 8 a.m. class. Some of it is actually related to biological clocks, like your actual deep biorhythms. I'm just going to be quick on this topic. I know it's a tough one. That um, the two main eating disorders that tend to be problematic for people at this stage are anorexia and bulimia. And I wanted to point to the point you to the alert or highlight the point that, notice the second word there, right? The nervosa word, that you can see how the nervosa is like, you basically see the word nervous there. And that these are both anxiety related issues within the context of eating and within the context of control. That there's huge influences of these things by peers, whether we're talking about substance use or whether we're talking about anorexia, um, and eating disorders. So anorexia is definitely more of a female thing statistically, although there can be anorexic males obviously too. It's a much bigger problem with females. Bulimia is too, but bulimia, if a male's gonna have an eating disorder, it's more likely bulimia. Um, Bulimia is less hard, I mean, less easy to spot because people can have this unhealthy pattern of binging and purging that results in a fairly normal appearing body weight. I would say too that another topic that never gets talked about in the discussion of eating disorders is males using steroids. I think you could argue that that's also an eating disorder. That's also someone doing something to purposely change a body that they don't like. It's complicated, but when I was in high school, I think steroids were a way bigger thing. I knew a bunch of buddies that would do cycles of steroids, and I remember it being very available. Um, I have no idea about nowadays, but I think there's an argument. They even used to have a term called bigorexia, which was like this feeling that teenage boys feel that like I can remember even hockey coaches telling me like I'd be better if I was 40 pounds heavier or like 20 pounds heavier or like whatever, right? Like, and is that much different than telling a girl that she'd be more beautiful if she was thinner? It's like those are both pretty, in a way, pretty dangerous topics. Now, they're similar, they're very different, but they're similar in that they're both speaking to the person's self concept of body. And what we know now is like taking, like, say, for example, human growth hormone as like a steroid to be better at your rep hockey team while you're a teen. It's like the long term damage you're doing to your testosterone, and it's like, well, as soon as you stop, you're going to gain tons of weight. It's going to like totally backfire. And it's, again, I don't know, maybe steroids are different now, but my point is that this is all linked to body image stuff. Um, okay, I think I'm going to stop here, cut this into 2 videos because it'll just make it a bit smoother. And I hope that first part was okay, and I'll see you soon.